Sometimes our custody cases can get a little bit more complicated. There's dynamics involved when you're dealing with children that aren't there in every case, but when they are, they're really important and they can be really ugly. So today we're going to look at three: parental alienation, drug and alcohol use and abuse, and then domestic violence. Parental alienation is kind of this, what I would consider a dirty word at the courthouse when it comes to children. One of the things about parental alienation is sort of the fear of the unknown. So I want to take that away from us today by defining what parental alienation is. It's a social dynamic generally occurring due to divorce or separation when a child expresses unjustified hatred or unreasonably strong dislike of one parent, making access by the rejected parent difficult or impossible. These feelings may be influenced by negative comments by the other parent and by the characteristics of the rejected parent, such as a lack of empathy or warmth. This isn't a single act. Parental alienation is not something that is a one-time deal, that dad says to kid, mom's a loser, or mom says to kid, dad's a deadbeat. It's not a one-time thing. It is a series of events that transpire oftentimes during the course of litigation. It doesn't tend to happen a lot until separation has occurred. There's a lot of problems with parental alienation when it's in a custody case. The first one is that it's not recognized as a disorder by DSM-4. And if you've talked to mental health professionals, you're going to find that there's a disagreement between them. Some of them believe that parental alienation syndrome is a diagnosable disorder. Some of them believe it's sort of hocus pocus magic. So the other difficulty that you're going to face if you have parental alienation is that you're not going to be able to open up a book that's going to tell you if a child walks in and exhibits signs A, B, C, and D, then they're experiencing parental alienation. So that can cause a problem. It's also difficult to prove in court for some of the reasons we've already talked about. A lot of this activity takes place behind closed doors. It takes place outside of our client's presence. Because the child is generally involved, they're not going to talk about it. They're not going to tell their friends. They're not going to go and tell their parent, the other parent. So it can be difficult to show to a court what's going on. Another problem that's starting to go away is some gender assumptions and biases. When parental alienation first became a hot topic in the 70s, there was an assumption that it was always happening or occurring by mother because she generally had the children a majority of the time, and so it was an assumption that, well, if she's got them most of the time, she's the one alienating child from father. It's actually somewhat switched a little bit over the past few years to actually assume that maybe dads are going to be more guilty of it because of their personality, their nature. But a lot of that stuff is shifting away, but I have run into it on occasion, especially in the mental health community. And finally, probably the biggest one is just a general lack of knowledge of the signs, the causes, and the concerns. Myself, I wasn't very familiar with it until I was confronted with it in a case. Part of it is, like I said, it's somewhat a dirty word. You don't want to bring it up in the courthouse. It's one of those accusations that can be thrown around without a lot of proof because it's difficult to prove. So turning our attention to the second of today's issues, drug or alcohol abuse. Well, how do they impact a custody litigation case? Well, there's the obvious. If you have a problem, you may end up with sole custody, or it may impact your custody to some degree. It also can impact your visitation or your parenting time with your child either being reduced or having supervised or having to jump through hurdles to get it. And one that's not on there that's also important is child support. You know, a lot of these child support tends to always be tied to the time that you spend with your kids. So if you have less time, if your client has less time with their children, it's going to impact their child support as well. Well, an important thing for us to be able to do on either side of this issue is to distinguish between use and abuse. And I always start with a thorough interview with my client. Tell me what's going on, either in your life or in your spouse's life, and let's figure out if this is a problem, if this is a social drinker, and you can generally do that fairly quickly. just by asking a few questions, getting a timeline from them about their relationship. A big one is obviously if there's been any criminal issues in the past. The second thing to ask is, does this use or abuse of drugs or alcohol put the children in any risk or potential risk? Are there things that are going to concern the court with the use and abuse? The problem I've found with courts is that with alcohol, it's always a moving target. What is use? What is abuse? And part of that is you may not know your judge well enough to know maybe this person also has a problem with alcohol or is a heavy social drinker or some of those things. So alcohol use tends to be a more subjective standard. What is use? What is abuse? I think we could all agree somebody who had 10 DUIs in the last 12 months probably has a problem. But what if somebody was just consuming a couple of bottles of wine every week and hadn't had any legal problems? So it's always a moving target. Drugs tend to be a tougher standard. We all know you can file a motion for a drug test. If you get a dirty drug test, immediately you're asking for supervised or limited visitation. And it's because there is kind of that bright line test. Also know the historical perspective of your client. Like I mentioned about that interview, is understand what's out there if there are some DUIs or arrests, if there is a history. That's going to give you a lot of insight into whether there's an issue of use or abuse. Real quickly, because I'm kind of running short on time, let's look at our favorite issue in custody cases, which is domestic violence. With domestic violence, you always have to kind of walk a fine line. There's two sides to this. When you're advocating for protection, make sure you're doing so on some very solid allegations. Over-exaggerating or making false allegations could potentially subject your client to losing custody, losing visitation. Also, when you're defending, you need to be careful that you're not putting your client or kids in a dangerous situation. The last thing you want to do is put your client in a position where more allegations can crop up. Again, how does this impact custody? Very similar to drugs and alcohol. It's going to affect visitation, probably going to play a part in a custody determination. And again, not related is child support. Another one that we're probably familiar with is the ex parte order that kicks your client out of the house. That can kind of start things out on a rocky road. And it's obviously going to create an immediate wedge between the client and their child if they're not around. What to do when you're asking for protection? Again, this is sort of a generic strategy on how to approach these problems. If there's an emergency, you need to take immediate action. Courts generally don't like to see you bringing something up about violence months down the road saying it's a problem and the other party needs to have supervised visitation. If it was an issue when it occurred, that's when you need to address it. Obviously, you need to reduce or eliminate interaction with the abuser. However you can do that through the court. Maybe you tell the client to go somewhere else for the night or take the kids somewhere else or go stay with grandma or grandpa. But eliminate that interaction. Request a psychological workup of both parties. I always ask for both, my client as well. That way the court has a full picture of the case, a full idea of what's going on. Ask for supervised visitation or exchanges. This is going to prevent, obviously, any further domestic abuse. And restrict any additional contact that you can. Phone calls, emails, texts, make sure those are monitored or at least restricted to some degree if there is domestic abuse going on. And then always make sure that the children are ready to testify if your judge likes to hear from the children. Make sure that they're able to express what's going on and talk about what's going on. And again, you can do that through other sources other than just having the child appear directly in court. You can have them talk to counselors or other mental health professionals.